Hello, everyone. This is going to be 11.6, the Spanish-American War. This is really what set off a lot of American imperialism. We talked about some earlier acquisitions, Hawaii, kind of, and Alaska, definitely, but this is where we became an imperial nation. And so this is a primary source. It's the front page of the New York Journal on February 17th, 1898. It was written one day after the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, and they immediately jumped to the conclusion that the destruction of our warship, the USS Maine, was the work of an enemy. Turns out that it wasn't, most likely. It was probably just an explosion of our boiler, but that didn't matter at the time. So this is a primary source. Our objectives: we're going to explain the causes of the Spanish-American War. We just saw one. We're going to identify the major battles. We're going to describe the consequences of the war and the debate over imperialism. And we're going to examine the causes and consequences of the Philippine insurrection. So let's start with, how did this Spanish-American War begin? Well, by the late 19th century, the late 1800s, Spain was on its way out as a world power. They were no longer the powerhouse they used to be when they came over with Christopher Columbus. It had only a few colonies left. It had Puerto Rico, it had Cuba, it had the Philippine Islands over near China. America was also investing a lot of money in these Spanish colonies. We had a lot of money in Puerto Rican sugar and Cuban sugar as well. Then, in 1895, the Cubans rose up in revolt against the Spanish. José Martí led a revolution in Cuba to try to get rid of the Spanish. In response to this, the Spanish governor put Martí and his followers into legit, this is what they called them, concentration camps, where thousands died. And most Americans at this time had a lot of sympathy towards the rebels. It reminded us of our fight against England. It also reminded us of the fact that we had written the Monroe Doctrine that said, look, if any American Western Hemisphere territories want to break away from their colonizers, we're going to help them out. So we kind of felt the need to step in and intervene. Here, by the way, is José Martí, who said, "It is necessary to make virtue fashionable." During this time, who was calling for war and who was taking the side of the Cubans? Mainly it was the articles written in newspapers. Newspapers owned by guys like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst helped to get Americans on the side of the Cubans. There are newspapers like the New York World and the New York Journal, the one we saw at the beginning. They are what we would call yellow press today. They sometimes told true stories, but oftentimes, even if the stories were true, the stories would be wild and inaccurate and sensationalized, and basically trying to get people to buy the newspaper above all else. And so this led to huge stories about Spanish atrocities in Cuba, some of which were true, and some of which were sort of exaggerated. They also pushed America to join in on the side of the rebels. So America sent a warship to Havana to keep an eye on the Cubans during this insurrection, called the USS Maine. So here's the yellow press today. Today, we would maybe tabloid journalism. Clickbait is a good example of modern tabloid yellow journalism today. And here's William Randolph Hearst, who once said, he thought the war would be great for selling papers. He once said one of his people was down in Cuba, a illustrator named Frederick Remington, and Remington sent him a text, a wire, a telegraph, saying, "Everything is quiet here. I wish to return. There will be no war." William Randolph Hearst wired back, "Please remain. You provide the pictures, I'll provide the war." And he did. In 1898, William Randolph Hearst got his hands on a letter written by the Spanish ambassador insulting our president, President McKinley. He printed it under a headline saying it's the worst insult, all caps, to the United States in its history. Some things never change. All caps is still big in yellow journalism of today. And this inspired a lot of sort of aggressive nationalism, this sort of like gung-ho, go America kind of spirit, known as jingoism, and also helped push us closer to war. We just needed that one thing to push us over the edge. And then we found that one thing. So, pretty quickly after this, the USS Maine, which was in the harbor in Havana in Cuba, blew up. That explosion killed 266 American sailors. A very fast, very loosely done investigation by the Americans decided that the Spanish had blown up our ship. This is what the Yellow Press had been claiming for days already. And it later proved to be incorrect. It's believed that the boiler just sort of had a malfunction instead. However, this was used as a reason to go to war. So here is an illustration of the explosion of the USS Maine. Supporters of the war said that we needed to go to war with Spain, and they started using memory of the Maine as a way to do it, saying, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." In April, William McKinley asked Congress to declare war, and they did. The U.S. Navy very quickly surrounded Cuban ports, and William McKinley called for over 100,000 volunteers to fight in this war. So suddenly we are hip deep into a war with Spain. And we did pretty darn well, I have to say. Over 200,000 volunteers joined up into this war, this Spanish-American War, for a lot of different reasons. Jingoism, Americanism, the quest for honor and glory. America prepared to attack the Spanish in Cuba. They planned to attack the Spanish in Puerto Rico. But there was also news that we had actually already defeated the Spanish in the Philippines, in Asia. So on May 1st, 1898, basically about 5 minutes after this war started, Commodore George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila without losing a single American soldier. Our allies, we were allied with the Filipino people. The Filipinos were fighting for independence from Spain, and they were hoping that after the war they would get their independence. More on that later. The leader of the Filipinos was a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. And America was able to conquer the Philippine Islands in just a few months with very little in the way of American casualties. So here are the Philippine Islands. Off the coast of Malaysia, as you can see on the bottom left there. Here is Commodore George Dewey, and here is Emilio Aguinaldo, who was alive from 1869 to 1964. He was born in the Spanish colony of the Philippines, lived through the time when it was the American colony of the Philippines, and died in the independent country of the Philippines in 1964. He was a general. He was shortly the president of the Philippines. From 1899 to 1901. And as we're going to see, he's going to have one or two problems with the Americans. And although he had signed allegiance to the United States after we took over the Philippine Islands, he very quickly became sort of angry with the United States. And during World War II, he actually sided with the Japanese when they took over the Philippines, hoping that they would kick out the Americans and again give them independence, which is what he had been looking for the entire time. So, at the same time that George Dewey was capturing the Philippines, we were landing in Cuba, over in the Caribbean. The most famous group of soldiers in Cuba were a group known as the Rough Riders. They were a group of volunteers formed by Teddy Roosevelt, who we talked about last section. They fought and defeated the Spanish at San Juan Hill. And their sort of colorful victory and the fact that Teddy Roosevelt was sort of already a cartoon favorite in America, this led to Roosevelt becoming a hero. And his victories in Cuba helped lead Roosevelt to become a national hero, the governor of New York, the vice presidential candidate, and eventually president after McKinley was assassinated. So here is Teddy Roosevelt with the Rough Riders atop San Juan Hill in Cuba. Now, the war came to an end very quickly after the Battle of San Juan Hill. This was a very short war. In the end, only about 400 Americans died during the Spanish-American War, although about 3,000 died from disease, not bullets. Now, the war was a turning point in a lot of ways. So, the Spanish-American War was pretty short. There was not a huge body count. In fact, our Secretary of State, a guy named John Hay, who we'll talk about later, called it quite, I find this lovely turn of phrase, a splendid little war. It was almost like it was a weekend off, it was a weekend war. However, the big question became, we just got a whole bunch of territory after we defeated the Spanish. Are we going to let them go? or are we going to keep it? So, in December of 1898, we acquired Puerto Rico, we acquired Cuba, we acquired Guam in the Pacific Ocean, and we got the Philippine Islands from Spain thanks to this Treaty of Paris. It seems that a lot of treaties are called the Treaty of Paris, but anyway. During the war, Congress had passed an amendment. This was part of the war declaration, actually. We promised that after the war was over, we would give Cuba its independence. And we did, but we decided to keep Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Especially, some people were like, we really should keep Cuba too. They got a lot of really good stuff there. And right up to nowish, Guam and Puerto Rico are still territories of the United States of America. They belong to America, but they are not states in America. This is along with American Samoa, that we pick up a little bit later, and the U.S. Virgin Islands as well. Now, President McKinley saw the Americans taking the Philippines as uplifting the Philippines, helping them out, civilizing them, making them better. Plus, we were also worried that if we gave up the Philippines, then somebody else would just take them over, like Japan or China or something like that, or, some European country. There were many groups, however, that were opposed to imperialism. So we talked in the last section a lot about the people who were pro-imperialism. People who were against it included guys like William Jennings Bryan, who we met as one of the leaders of the Populist Party and the Democratic Party, Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie was very anti-imperialism, and they formed a group called the Anti-Imperialist League. Their main argument was that it was un-American for America to have colonies because, like I said, America had started out as a colony. And we fought for our own independence, so how could we become a colonizer after we had fought so hard for our own independence? It seemed to go against the very, core tenets of America. So here's Mark Twain saying, I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land. Now, by acquiring these territories, America got a lot of land, we got some trade, we got naval bases, we got sugar, we got pineapples, we got lots of stuff. And this helped boost our economy. Now, another important point is that even though we said we would give Cuba their independence, we did still find a way to kind of put our foot in the door a little bit, which is the Cuban Constitution had an amendment in it called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment said that America had the right to intervene, that was the word that was used, in Cuba anytime that we saw fit. We also took up several naval bases there at the same time. So we basically stuck our foot in the door and said, if we don't like the way things are going in Cuba, we have the right to jump in and fix it. So here, by the way, is one of the, it's the only American base left on Cuba after Cuba had a revolution in 1959. This is Guantanamo Bay, which is now a home for our prisoners of war from the War on Terror. Now, let's look at the effects of expansionism on the Philippines during this time. So, America had held on to the Philippines, partially to expand our influence, to make sure that we were competing imperialistically with Cuba, with Europe, and also to gain a trading spot in Asia. Now, Emilio Aguinaldo, the head of the Filipino resistance, who had just fought off the Spanish, was like, okay, we're independent now, right? But when America said, no, you're now our colony instead of a Spanish colony, Aguinaldo led another rebellion against the United States. And this Filipino insurrection, this uprising, used the same sort of reasoning that America had used back during the American Revolution, that they were fighting against tyranny for their own freedoms. They were the new Minutemen, basically, of the Philippine Islands. Now, Filipinos used irregular warfare. It wasn't a stand-up fight. It was a, shoot your enemy and then disappear into the woods and the forests and the jungles. And this is known as guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla coming from the Spanish word meaning little war, basically. A mini war. Using hit-and-run tactics against your enemies. In response, America started to put Filipino rebels into prison camps. Very dangerous, deadly, especially with disease, prison camps. Now, by the time all of this insurrection was done, a lot of atrocities had been perpetrated by both sides. American soldiers killed and burned Filipino villages. Filipino insurrectionists killed Americans whenever they could. By the time it was finally done, 5,000 Americans and over 200,000 Filipinos had either been killed or died. Think of this almost as a dress rehearsal for Vietnam, basically, that we were fighting an irregular war. This was not a grab your gun and march towards the enemy kind of war. It was irregular. It was, lots of fighting in the woods, basically. Now, America had to commit large numbers of troops to the Philippine Islands during this time, and like I said, they had to commit many atrocities to get the country under control. Now we did, and those who supported imperialism said, well, look what we gave them after the insurrection was over. We gave them better education. We gave them law and order and a certain amount of self-rule and better roads and things like that, too. Now, meanwhile, the Filipinos were very successful using this guerrilla warfare against a larger and better equipped army. So this is a bit of a warning, a small graphic image. This is a group of American soldiers standing over a mass grave of Filipinos during this time. Lastly, the governor of the Philippines was a future president of the United States, William Howard Taft. We talked about him back in 11.4. He was able to win the support of many of the Filipinos, but occasionally he was not above using brutal tactics to keep control. He also did give them a certain amount of self-rule, saying that, you can, elect your local leaders and things like that. He also started to modernize the roads in the cities and worked with several influential Filipinos to try to maybe even start moving self-rule over to the Filipino side. In 1916, Congress passed the Jones Act saying that eventually, once they were ready, once we decided that they were ready, the Philippine Islands would become an independent country. This took until 1946, right after World War II. The Philippines did become an independent country. So here's William Howard Taft as the military governor of the Philippine Islands, sitting atop a water buffalo. Now, in 1900, William McKinley beat William Jennings Bryan again for the presidency. And so McKinley, who was an imperialist, beat Bryan, who was an anti-imperialist. And so this was seen as the victory of imperialism over anti-imperialism. A pretty clear statement at that time. The Spanish-American War also made the United States a large war power, world power. And this was a turning point in American foreign policy. From here on in, we would be much more active in what's going on around the world.